Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be based, and welcome to today's session. So my name is Elena Agaragimova. I'm a co-founder at Bessern, where we're looking to transform the way people learn and increasing employee productivity and well-being in the workplace. Welcome, welcome. So just a quick couple of points before we dive into today's session. You are all muted to minimize the background noise. However, you have a super useful question box that I highly recommend you use throughout the session. Drop us your questions, communicate with us, your suggestions, your stories, just interact with us. So we would love to have you contribute to the discussion. And while we wait, I see a few people still signing on. So while we wait for them, if you just drop me in the chat box, in the question box, just drop me if you can see my screen okay, and where are you joining us from? Let me know where are you guys joining us from. So you have a little question box, you can use it, or the chat box, whichever one you have handy in front of you. So 2 questions. 1, can you see my screen all right? And number 2 is, can you, or where are you joining us from? So we have somebody from Baltimore. Wonderful. Thank you guys for, you can hear me and see me. Beautiful. Somebody from Southampton in the UK. Wonderful. Welcome, welcome. Thanks for joining us. In the US, it's quite, I think it's morning. Yes, it's not too early though. We have somebody who is from Dubai, of course. What about the rest of you guys? Yeah, 11 a.m. Neil. Yep. Welcome, welcome. Wonderful. So good. So you guys know how to use the chat box. Beautiful. Keep dropping us as you're joining. Keep dropping us. Let us know where you're joining us from. How are you feeling today? The topic is very, very interesting today. So, you know, it seems that we're all striving towards happiness, right? Yet we still, in many cases, remain unhappy. So what is really, like, what is the truth behind happiness? What are the myths behind happiness? What does our brain has to do with how we, you know, become happy or unhappy? Is there a default level of happiness, right? So, and is it that when we reach somewhere, do we feel happy? Is it that when we, you know, achieve something? Is it that, you know, when we, you know, find that partner or that job or get that salary, right? Is it that what makes us happy, in fact, or is it something else? Right. So many people mistaken that this belief that happiness comes after we get that better job, right? That we find a more attractive partner or have that higher salary. But you know, through several studies conducted in positive psychology, we can actually learn more about what really contributes to a better life. And it might not be what you think. So this is what we're going to be discussing today. And I'm super, super excited to have Dr. Louise Lambert with us. She's a Canadian registered psychologist who develops, delivers, and evaluates positive psychology and positive education intervention programs for organizations and schools across GCC region. She has been featured in various different publications. She's done a ton of research on these topics, and she also teaches on these topics. So I'm really excited to welcome her. So Dr. Louise, you can go ahead and come and join us. And of course, we have Yvonne Palomino with us today. So if both of you can just go ahead and come up and introduce yourself a bit more as well, if you would like, and then we'll dive into the topic.
Hi, Elena, and hi to our guests. I'm super excited to be here and hopefully challenge some of your thoughts about happiness, but also answer some of your questions. So thank you.
I'm so sorry, I forgot to turn on the microphone. So, one, I'm super excited to be tonight with Dr. Louise. One of the things that, in fact, it has been almost like one of the bigger questions that I had in my life. I am a numbers person. I have a background, a scientific background. So whatever I think of, it needs to be quantifiable. And the concept of happiness, in fact, belongs to the big questions about how am I going to be happiness? faith, and death. So these are the three philosophical questions that I have always been asking myself. And how can you demonstrate that you are progressing, specifically in terms of happiness? So today I'm so glad that some of my big questions that I still remember having being 17 years old, asking myself, maybe some of the answers are going to come tonight.
I hope so, although you're setting the bar pretty high.
No sound.
It wouldn't be a webinar without it.
Listen,
Yeah.
I just want to see if you can read my lips. That's all. I'm just testing.
Okay.
So as I was saying, but you didn't hear. So let's go ahead and dive in. And I wanted to remind our audience that you can drop your questions, interact with us throughout the session. So I will be calling those out as you guys drop them. So go ahead and make sure to ask us questions. So Dr. Louise, Yvonne, talk to us a little bit more about when it comes to happiness, what is it really? Like, what is happiness? How do we define happiness? There's so many definitions, so much talk about happiness. What is it really?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So first, let's start from the scientific perspective. So we don't actually use the word happiness. We use the word happiness in social media, talking on the news, doing webinars like this, but really in the science of positive psychology, we actually don't use that word because it doesn't have a definition. So instead, we use things like subjective well-being, we might use life satisfaction, but we also use a lot of what are called proxy measures. So proxy means different approximations, if you will, different types of evaluations that would sort of map onto living a good life. But the two main measures when we're trying to find out how happy somebody are indeed subjective well-being, life satisfaction. So what do we mean by that? Subjective well-being is the one you'll see the most in the research literature, and that one involves an evaluation of your life. So when you think about your life overall, are you satisfied with how it's going so far? And for most of us, that answer typically is, yeah, not so bad. So worldwide studies have shown most people answer on a 7. Now, maybe that's just because hindsight is 20/20. We have this inborn bias to more optimistically evaluate things that have passed with time, of course. Maybe not that bad week you had at work, you know, just a few days ago. But the other component of happiness is also the experience of positive emotion. So the more positive emotions you experience more frequently, that's an indication of happiness, and also a lack of negative emotion. Now, I shouldn't say lack, actually that was a bad word, less negative emotions relative to positive emotions. So that's really how we define happiness, at least from a research or a scientific perspective.
It seems to me, in fact, and you said it quite right, there is a kind of subjectivity regarding happiness. There is these internal beliefs or these expectations about the future that, for instance, if we, and Elena mentioned it, if we have a good job, if we have money, if we have find true love, or we have awesome stuff like a big car or big TV or a good body, that we are going to be happy. And it seems like it's almost like our brain, our mind, is almost playing tricks with us, because we have an expectation for the future, and our brain doesn't know how to balance in absolute terms. In fact, it's always kind of a comparison versus others. And the sad thing is that in our modern days, we are so much bombarded by media that we are always comparing versus others. What we see in the Kardashian series, what we see, the pictures that we see in social media. So the big question that I have, and I don't have really the answer, are we becoming less happy because we have the opportunity to compare ourselves to the rest of the world today?
Well, the Kardashians are pretty amazing. I mean, let's give them that, right? So you raise a lot of different points there. So one, maybe I'll start from the end and then we'll back up to expectations. So you talked about, maybe if I get a car or a great body or I fall in love, I get a raise, do these things contribute to happiness? So again, if we go back to our definition of happiness, it's positive emotions, an absence or fewer negative emotions, and a positive evaluation of our life. So are those things going to make a difference? Actually, yes. Point number one. But point number two, we also have a really bad habit of adapting. We adapt to everything. We adapt to good things, which is bad. We adapt to bad things, which is good. So what that means, let's take a really simple example. You really love chocolate cake and you eat it every single day. Now, for me, I don't really like sweet stuff. It would take about 10 minutes before I go, okay, that's enough. Elena might really love chocolate cake and she might last 6 days, but at the end of 6 days, even that really good thing becomes gross because she's adapted to it. And we have this natural ability, if you will, to adapt to things. Now, that does have an advantage because it keeps us seeking new things. And we also thrive on variety as well. If you do the same thing every day, that gets tired and we get bored and we just kind of give up. So it helps us kind of seek out new things, and also it allows us to grow as we're seeking out these new things. But again, the disadvantage is that because we quickly adapt to everything, even good things no longer bring us the same positive emotion that they once did. This is why when you get your raise for the first week, 2 weeks, you're like, yay. And then it's like, I still have bills to pay. Life goes on. I actually have more work. Nothing's really changed in the end. So sometimes these things can have a lasting or a longer effect on subjective well-being. Other times they're really only temporary. Now, I'll just touch on relationships for a moment, and these are kind of interesting. So relationships generally do increase what is called our set point. So our set point, Elena, you had talked about this earlier, are we kind of stuck at a specific level of happiness? And unfortunately, we kind of are. However, that level, the definition of that level can also change, but it doesn't tend to happen in relationships. So what that means is kind of the same thing as going to the gym. You get stronger and stronger and stronger. You will see progress. And then you kind of level off, and maybe you felt you were at a level 5, you went up to a level 6, you move up to a level 7, but now that level 7 feels like the level 5 because we need to keep growing, moving up and up. But relationships, on the other hand, don't necessarily do that because we don't always adapt in relationships. Now, again, we adapt to conversations if you're going to talk about the same thing all the time. We adapt to events and situations if you're going to do the same things all the time. We adapt to other things which can make relationships seem old and a little bit boring, even when they started out really well. So this idea of adaptation really can harm our levels of happiness, but on the other hand, they can be useful for negative things. And what would be an example of that? Let's say you're going through a divorce, you're really miserable, it's awful. The good news is if you just kind of hang around long enough, hang in there, you will eventually adapt to that as well. So it's good for bad things, it's bad for good things, but that's in part why things don't necessarily make us happier, because we adapt to everything.
That
it is almost like,
sorry, Yvonne, but I like, again, it just really opened up my mind to this, because this is why you sometimes observe situations maybe and you're like, how can this person be in this situation, right? Like, how are they, that's because they adapt, like they just get used to it, they adapt. Absolutely. And you're absolutely right, like it makes sense, right? Like you adapt to whatever situation you're in. And but it's also what I'm hearing is that it sounds like when we kind of get that new experience, we expect that it's going to give us that thing that it's supposed to give us, and when it does, then we're like, oh, okay, well, now I have it, now what do I do with it now? And then you sort of, and then you move on, and then you need that next a rush of happiness or whatever you want to call it, that little feeling, right? So it's almost like our expectations is what fails us at the end of the day. Like we have these expectations and perhaps assumptions about how certain things should be. So
Okay.
yeah.
So there's another interesting thing about these expectations. And again, like everything in psychology, there's never a straight answer. It's always a little bit of yes, a little bit of no. So when it comes to expectations, these are actually good for us in the sense that they keep us hopeful, they keep us, targeted and focused on the future, they keep us setting goals because we actually have the belief that, yeah, I'm going to create change in my life, and that's what gives us that momentum. So expectations are fantastic. Expectations are also terrible because they ruin the present really quickly. So I always take the example of going on holiday, and lots of studies have actually shown this. What they've shown is that in the 2 or 3 weeks prior to going on holiday, that's when you're your happiest. It's not the actual holiday. It's thinking of going on the holiday. It's the anticipation. It's imagining in your head it's going to be great weather. It's going to be fantastic. There's going to be this lovely blue sky. The food's going to be great. I mean, everything's going to be wonderful. And then the reality is it rains all the time. Your 5-star hotel runs out of electricity. You get sick with food poisoning and, all the rest. But we can make that work for us. So when it comes to anticipation and expectations, we can, the trick is knowing when to turn on the expectation and the anticipation of the future. So in those 2-3 weeks before you go on the holiday, imagine it, like absolutely cut out little pictures in the newspaper, think about it, revel in these, visual, maybe not memories because they haven't happened yet, but visual pictures that you have of this holiday. And then right before the holiday, stop. No more expectation. Then actually just stop thinking. Then you want to switch gears and just do okay, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Because if you go into that holiday with that expectation, real life is never as good as the one in your head. So part of happiness is kind of understanding these things and managing our fantasy world and then managing our real world and trying to, balance the two so that we can maintain some positive emotion.
Louise, what is amazing is that what you said is quite powerful. In fact, it's almost like, and I learned about this concept of miswanting, which means basically the act of being mistaken about what and how much am I going to be happy if I get certain things in the future. So, and our brain, most of the time, he gets it wrong. So we expect that we are going to be happier if we get more money. Then it happens, we get a little bit more of money, and very often we are not satisfied with what we got. There was a study, I think that it was in Princeton in 2010, where they wanted to see if there was a correlation between how much you earn and how happy you become. And it almost looks like there is a moment, there is an amount of money that has been determined specifically, and after that amount of money, you are not happy anymore. I think it was $75,000. We have discussed a lot about it with Elena. That's why I'm looking at her. So after $75,000, your happiness does not increase as much. But between 0 and 75,000, because you need to survive, you need to take care of your basics. There is a meaning for getting a little bit wealthier. There is a direct correlation between happiness and wealth. After that,
yeah,
nothing.
And I know that study you're talking about. So that's by Ed Diener, and so 75,000 is indeed the cutoff point. It's about 200,000 dirhams in the UAE, which, when you think about it, and that 75,000, that's actually for a household of 4. So again, it's just at the tipping point of our basic needs. And after that, money does not categorically add to our happiness. However, what they did find is that once that happiness goes up and then it flattens at the 75,000, there are 2 things that matter after that. There are how you spend your money. That's really the difference. And then it's all about the experiences you create. So if you're lucky enough to have more disposable income, you've met all your basic needs, you've got a little bit extra cash. After that, what is going to generate the most happiness is buying experiences. So taking your kids on a ski trip or on a camping trip, and you're going to sit around and play Monopoly and, you know, make s'mores on the fire or whatever it is. What does not add to happiness with that same amount of money is buying TVs, shoes, bags. Again, it's not that it's zero, but it's just a little like, yay. And then it disappears basically by the time you hit the parking lot. The other thing that is not great about investing in objects is that objects are so fragile. So you've got a great pair of shoes and then you scuff them. Or there's a new model and now yours are suddenly old, and just exactly an hour ago when you thought you're really hot and looking amazing, now somebody else walks in with the newer ones. Now suddenly you look old and outdated. So they become a point of comparison in themselves, and they actually undermine our happiness. So again, if you have the option, if you're lucky enough to have this disposable income, it's all about experiences, going to a concert, going skiing, learning to play the violin, you know, taking courses, making donations, building a school somewhere, rather than, you know, just buying another bag. It doesn't really do much. That's long lasting at any rate.
Mm.
I want to touch on another thing you talked about, this idea of the fact that we overestimate our emotions. So actually, I just talked about that in class today with my students, and it's called affective forecasting. So Dan Gilbert talks a lot about this, and it turns out, so if we think about affective, it's just a fancy word for emotions, and forecasting is kind of like we're trying to forecast the weather. We're trying to predict how much something is going to be helpful to us or not. And when it comes to our emotions, we're terrible at it. So we misconstrue the weight or the effect that something is going to have. So we think, if I just get this job, if I just get this person in my life, if I just get these shoes, the amount of positive emotion, happiness will be huge. I'll be happy forever. So my students tell me this. If I get an A, I'll be happy forever. I'm thinking, forever? You'll be happy for about 2 hours and you'll forget about it. But anyway, but we also over exaggerate how unhappy we will be as well. So if I lose this job, if I lose this person, if I lose this contract, I will be so unhappy. And this inability to forecast appropriately actually makes us engage in bad decisions a lot of the time. So understanding how our mind works, understanding how it is that we deal with emotion can actually help us make better choices and be maybe a little bit less scared to let go of things or to jump into things as well. For that.
Dr. Louise, so if I understood correctly, I'm trying to process what you just said. So the sense of purpose, in fact, becomes more important once we have covered our basic needs. Is that correct?
It can be. I mean, that's certainly one part of it. So essentially, what the research would suggest is it's the emotional experiences you create. So although I talked about the fact that objects are not necessarily a good place to invest in, if you imbue that object with meaning, if you give it meaning of some sort, then it can become a positive thing. So if I'm spending my money on this crazily expensive work of art, still an object in itself, but it means something to me. Now I get a little bit more value out of that. So meaning, yes, does in fact play a role. So as long as it's not just, you know, these empty purchases, buying to buy, buying to occupy the afternoon, these things generally don't generate much. But if something is meaningful to you, there's a purpose behind it. And again, you know, art is an interesting one. It is just something you hang on your wall, but there's research that goes behind it. There's an emotional experience to it. There's a story. You can. It's also an investment as well. So it's not just a thing, but yes, indeed, there is emotion and meaning attached there.
Mm. So
Maybe I
what it sounds
muddied the
like,
water, but
yeah, so it sounds like there's a lot of choice that has to do, like we choose whether we choose to be happy or unhappy, essentially based on our thought patterns, perhaps based on how we view experience. So it sounds like there's actual step-by-step approach that we can create, some habits that we can create when it comes to maintaining that happiness, whatever you want, that level of fulfillment or whatever you want to call it. I don't even want to call it happiness, but so I'm really curious to hear about that. And also, I just wanted to let our audience know, go ahead and drop your questions. I see we have a couple of questions already. We'll get to them. For the rest of you guys, if you just drop us your thoughts about the discussion so far. Do you relate? Do you feel like you've sort of been in situations that we've discussed where you've adjusted, and or maybe your expectations were super high? So feel free to share if you feel comfortable. So Dr. Louise, Yvonne, when it comes to creating habits, how does that really work, and the step-by-step if we're to action it?
so this is where it gets very complicated but simple. And I get asked this question a long time. What can I do to be happier? And it's not like, what can I do to be fitter? Well, if you want to be fitter, just go run around and raise your heart rate and eat carrots, right? Happiness is a little bit more difficult because it has to fit for you. And there's a number of different models and theories, and one of the ones that I like, among many, is developed by Martin Seligman. So it's called the PERMA model. So the acronym PERMA. And essentially, this is looking at 5 different pathways to happiness. Now, the fact that there are 5 tells us there's more than one way to happiness. And some people do all 5, some people do 1, some people do 3. It really has to fit your personality, your lifestyle, your choices, and it has to really be part of your character almost. So I'll just describe them briefly, and then I'll kind of share with you how that fits into my life. So the first one is positive emotion. Now, this is the weakest of the 5. It does work, but this is a lot of what we're talking about now. If you only focus on generating positive emotions, these little short bursts of happiness, if you will, from eating chocolate cake, buying a new pair of shoes, things that don't really add much value, then you might actually undermine your happiness, or you're stuck continuously trying to find little hits of happiness because they don't last very long. On the other hand, they're not necessarily bad either. Spending time with your 2-year-old nephew, playing cards, giggling, acting like kids. That's an example of these little hits of positive emotion. Savoring, the smell after it rains, that smell of the dirt, right? I think most of us kind of go, oh, we noticed that. That's another little hit of positive emotion. Savoring your latte, your coffee in the morning, that's another hit of positive emotion. So they're not necessarily bad. It's just that if you only focus on positive emotion, they're just short-lived. That's the problem. And we have to keep seeking them out continuously to feel good. So that first pathway, it works, but it's tiresome because it only lasts like 6 seconds at a time. The next pathway is really about engagement. And this is the type of happiness that doesn't really feel good. My students are like, does that matter? Is that a thing? Yeah, it is. So when you're going to university and you failed 3 quizzes and you're miserable, you're tired, you're up at 2 a.m., you're studying, that's actually a form of happiness. It's the happiness that doesn't feel good, but it's the happiness that uses your skills and your talents. You're really focused on learning, you're growing, you're becoming a better person as a result of doing that. But it just kind of feels kind of rotten. That one is kind of the one I do. When I lose myself doing research, I'm writing, I'm trying to, construct arguments. I love this stuff. So again, it has to fit you. That would be somebody's idea of hell. And for me, that's like, yes, I get to spend a whole afternoon writing, right? So it really has to fit you. The third avenue, which is really, I shouldn't say popular, but tends to be more important in some cultures than others. So certainly in the UAE, there's much more importance on this one, and it's relationships. So relationships with family, relationships with your grandma, relationships with your cousins, It's a sense of belonging. You belong to a family, you belong to a neighborhood, you belong to a community, you belong to a society. And this is something that expats kind of struggle with when we get here, because we're just floating around and we have to find our tribe, so to speak, that sense of belonging. But relationships absolutely generate lots of happiness. They also generate lots of unhappiness when they're not good. So that's an interesting one. After that, we have meaning and purpose. So this might be, doing volunteer work, taking stock of what values you have. What are these higher order ideas that you can really get behind? So maybe social justice is your thing. Again, it doesn't really sound like something we'd include in a talk on happiness, but our values matter, and what we stand for actually matter. And that would be in the meaning and accomplishment, or sorry, yeah, meaning. And then finally, the last one is accomplishments. So achievements, those things you do just to say, yes, I did them. Right? So running a marathon, landing a business deal, or writing your first novel. It's being good at something, being able to say, I did that. I play the ukulele. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean it's important to others, but it's important to you. So when we talk about these habits, really it's about find a happiness lifestyle that works for you. So I always tell people, take notice of what feels good. Take notice of when you lose yourself in an activity. Take notice of when you feel like, yeah, I'm firing on all cylinders here. I feel like I'm coming alive by doing this. I feel like it's really a reflection of who I am. That's your habit. Keep doing more of that. Now, unless it's sitting on the couch eating, ice cream in your pajamas all day, then no. But, so it has to fit you.
Louise, when you were talking about these 5 principles, I couldn't avoid thinking about the concept of flow. In fact, which there are some elements. So I was thinking about it, but I mean, regardless that we call it whatever name or flow, it seems to me that in order to now that we have understood that the perceptions on the brain have a lot to do with our level of happiness, and that we have the choice to activate certain things, the only thing that should be constant is to create a process where in a daily basis you practice something, even if it is just 5 minutes, to allocate this time, I don't know, when you wake up early in the morning, just to define, for instance, what could work for you. What are the learnings from the previous mistake? Because we will do mistakes. I will take option 1 and I would definitely fail. So I need to have a learning to choose option 2, or another tweaking of my continuous experimentation in my life, but continuous iterations because as you say, this is more about the journey itself rather than the goal that will make us happy. So we need to always have like the goal of understanding our present, understanding what could make us happy, but it needs to be recurrent. It cannot be just a one-off. I will do it today, and then at the end of the year, when I feel that I didn't achieve what makes me fulfilled.
Mm-hmm. But there's also a couple of landmines as well. So I think I really hate the word happiness, to be honest, because it sets the bar so high. I think it's about thinking more about how do you make a life that is worth living. And when you feel that your life is worth living, you get up in the morning, you're like, hey, maybe the first thing I do is I'm going to go to the gym because that makes me feel like I come alive. And then it's going to be I'm going to sit and read the newspaper because I really like to learn and be, exposed to what's going on in the world. Then it's maybe I'm going to do some work, I'm going to research, or I'm going to meet with people. Or so I think you're right in the sense that it's thinking about on a daily basis, how do you construct your day in a way that is satisfying to you, knowing that, yeah, you got to do the dishes and take care of your kids and go to work. We got to do that stuff. But that there are moments in the day that you have chosen because they fit you and they bring out this sense of whether it's joy, interest, inspiration, peace, contentment, whatever you want to call it. But again, that makes your life feel like it's worthwhile. And I think when we call it, how do you make your life worthwhile, people kind of get that and they go, oh, well, I know that. Is that happiness? Yeah, that's it. Right. And I think sometimes there's this misperception that, because when we use the word happiness, people feel like, oh, wow, I need to be smiling every day. I need to be having like a party every day. No, no, like just don't pressure yourself, because we also know from very good studies that the more you pursue happiness directly, actually, the more unhappy you become. So it needs to be kind of an outcome of a good life versus, okay, we're going to have fun in the next hour, whether you like it or not. Like, it's not really a good recipe for, happiness. So yeah, it's kind of something that evolves, but there are some choices along the way that you're making because you know that, yeah, I like doing these things. And again, it brings out the best side of me.
So what it sounds like is that it's just, again, I mean, and Yvonne, I'm a fan of this concept, that it's really just about how do we spend our days? Well, like,
Yeah.
what is that? Where are we putting our energy? Because you're right, if we're spending our time, and as we were talking earlier, if you're spending your days sort of thinking about that or talking about the negative things, how do you possibly expect to even have a good day to begin with, right? So and it's also, where do you put your energy? Are you kind of just rolling out of bed every morning and just kind of making your way to the office, or do you wake up and you really feel that you have some kind of routine that works for you? And this is where I feel a lot of people fall off, is because they don't take time to determine what is it that works best for them, and they go for the 3 steps to be happier, the articles that we see out there that are like 5 steps, you do this, 5 things, you get happy, versus trying to figure out what works for me, what works for because everybody's different, right? For some people, they're happy with whatever salary, and everybody else is happy with a different salary, right? So it's understanding that what works for you, and two, the important point you mentioned earlier is not to numb the reality of what we're feeling with buying those materialistic things that just give us that little rush of sort of satisfaction, right? So it's good to do that, but being mindful of why we're doing it, and so I think that's very good points. I want to bring a couple. We have quite a few questions and comments. I want to those in, if you guys don't mind. So somebody asked, sometimes too much of positive feelings can lead to unhappiness. Is that true? How to keep the brain trained, and is it that necessary at all to be happy all the time? And you partially answered it.
No. Please do not pressure yourself to be happy all the time. That is a recipe to be miserable. So what we're aiming for, unfortunately, this happiness movement, so there's like the science of positive psychology, and then there's like this happiness industry, and they've kind of evolved at the same time. And the happiness industry, of course, needs something to sell you. So they're going to be like, you have to be happy all the time. No, you don't. That would make you manic. That would mean you need to be medicated. That actually means you're crazy. Like, no, it's not normal to be happy every single waking moment of the day. It's actually not normal. And so I want people to understand that, because I feel like there's so much pressure to be happy. It's making people unhappy. What is better is just to kind of stay open to life. Again, notice what works for you, and don't pressure yourself to feel a certain way. You're going to feel what you feel. And, Yvonne, I'm glad you brought up this idea of flow, because people mistake that. They don't count that time because they think it's work time. It's being absorbed in something. But that's a form of happiness. And while you're in it, you don't necessarily consider it happy, because we have this definition of happy that you always have a smile on your face and you're laughing and giggling. But you're not. Like, when I'm doing research, I'm 100% absorbed. That's happiness right there. That's a state of flow. The other thing that I think is very interesting, and to tap on to this question of, if you're too happy, will something bad happen, or something like that. There is what is called, so I do research with a guy called Mosan Joshinlu, amazing researcher, and he has come up with a concept called fear of happiness. And this is, more predominant in Islamic cultures. but we do see it in other parts of the world, even in the West as well. So when somebody has been depressed for a long time, there's a fear of being happy, because happiness does involve a bit of a loss of control. You know, you're just kind of throwing caution to the wind. You're not worrying, you're not planning, you're not deciding, you're just kind of going with it. And for a lot of people, that's really kind of scary. When we think about regionally this fear of happiness, though, there's kind of this idea that if you're too happy, and this is kind of reflects more of a collective society, if you're too happy, then obviously you're doing something on your own that we're not doing, right? Because collective society, we should all kind of be feeling the same thing because we're all doing things together. So if you're a lot happier than us, you've been up to something. So people become suspicious of you if you're too happy. So there's kind of this like, oh, I better just temper that. I better just, you know, keep that to myself. That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is there's kind of this belief that, again, if you're too happy, it's a path that could lead to sin. If you're too happy, you're going to start partying. You're going to start, you know, doing all these things that you shouldn't be doing. There's also another belief that if you're too happy and you show it, you will get the evil eye on you and something bad will happen. And then there's also the cultural piece as well. So there's a lot of different angles to this. And my students and I, we talked about this just 2 days ago, and one of them said, it's like you're not allowed to be happy. It's like you don't have permission to be joyful. So we kind of unpack that. And again, it comes back to that collective. We feel things collectively, and if you're feeling something different, like who do you think you are? It's kind of like, why do you get to feel happy and not us? Now, it's not to say that others aren't happy, but it raises questions. So yes, what we find is that certain cultures perceive happiness very differently, and it is not true that wanting to be happy is a universal. It's not. There are some cultures who are like, nope, we're good. We're going to go the meaningful route. We're going to do, you know, more of the spiritual route, more the in control route, because we want to stay on the straight and narrow. And this kind of wild, crazy, hedonic happiness, no, we're not going to do that. And that's fine. Again, because we know that there's so many different routes and pathways and definitions and meaning to happiness. So I guess in answer to that question, I've gone the long way, is do what works for you and have your own definition of happiness. There's not one. You get to pick it.
Yeah.
And we have a comment in regards to that, and says that absolutely valid point, Dr. Louise. Different factors bring happiness to different people. For me personally, at some point in my life, I thought certain things like good job, material things, etc., are the source of happiness. But now I eventually realized that it's the people around me who are the source of happiness, as well as sadness sometimes. And I also have a question as well. Do the traditional happiness habits, such as meditation and affirmations, have a huge impact on the mindset, or do they also count as those little hits you mentioned that are short-lived?
So to be honest, meditation is not my area. So I can't speak to that scientifically. So my area is more the positive psychology interventions, which are kind of the strategies to be happier, but that meditation would not fall under that tradition. But do people do that? Yes, absolutely. Again, I think it's coming back to what works for you. If that's part of your lifestyle, if this is part of your happiness, meaningful, making a life that is worthwhile for you, then by all means do that. So I mean, in many ways, the science is important to understand so that we can make informed choices. But if you found something that works for you, don't change that, because the science also says this works and this works and this works. So I'm going to take gratitude as an example. We hear about gratitude all the time. And there's nothing wrong with gratitude. Does it work? Yes. Does it work for everybody? No. It actually backfires for a lot of people. And this is an example of where if it doesn't work for you, stop doing it. Like, why would you keep doing that, right? And when we think about these happiness strategies, these positive psychology interventions, there's probably nearly 60 of them. but we only ever talk about 2 or 3. We always talk about mindfulness, we always talk about gratitude, but there's 58 other ones. And I think, when people start experimenting and looking around, surely you will find something that works for you. So again, trust yourself. If it fits for you, do that. It's simple as that. I want to add one more thing on that. So there's Paul Dolan has a great book called Designing for Happiness. Now, he's actually an economist, so very, Yvonne, kind of like you, right? Numbers. He does a lot of stuff around policy, but I read his book a couple of years ago, and there's one example that really stood out for me, and it's around this idea of deciding for you what works. So one of his little activities is think about the things you do on a daily basis that you do because everybody else is doing and it's supposed to make you happy, but really inwardly you're cringing and dying when you do it. And the example he uses is, how many times have you gone to this, oh, it's this amazing 5-star restaurant, you must go, and you go and you're like, oh, this is really expensive water, and you pretend to enjoy it because everybody's telling you should enjoy it, but really it doesn't bring you joy. And maybe what would bring you joy is listening to a podcast vacuuming. Now, you might not want to share that publicly. You're not going to be so popular, but do what works for you. So his whole idea is design your life in a way that works for you, because at the end of the day, you're living your life, nobody else.
I love it, and that's an action point for our audience as well, is to answer that question. I love it. So taking a moment, guys, to think about what are the things that you're doing each day that you're doing because you truly want to do them and you believe that, and it really does bring you that fulfillment, or you're doing it because you feel you're supposed to. So I love that. And so that's something to think about for everyone tonight. And I have another question. So regarding to effective forecasting, is there more value as an individual to temper our positive affect predictions versus enhancing our mitigation against negative affective forecasting? That's a loaded question.
Can you just repeat that last phrase? It just lagged a little bit.
Yeah, so is there more value as an individual to temper our positive effect prediction versus enhancing our mitigation against the negative effective forecasting? So should we focus
that's like
more
one of those
positive
double negatives?
Yes, it's a two double negative, yes.
Again, I think it's about there's another great book by Mark Manson, and I won't say the word, but it's basically F your feelings.
Yes.
I love it. And basically he says, don't pay so much attention to your feelings because they're 9 times out of 10, they're wrong. And I'm guilty of this all the time. I will catastrophize at 3 a.m. and I can't sleep and I'm freaking out. And then by 8 a.m. I wake up and I'm like, I don't know, there's something about daylight when everything just seems that much smaller. So I think it's about recognizing your patterns. When do you put too much investment into things you really think are going to bring you happiness, and is that true? So again, you can kind of look back and go, when have I fallen victim to my own expectations? Am I too hopeful and then it fails? Or never mind even if it fails, but am I just too hopeful and then I experience that drop? So that would be one area where maybe you want to temper that. Not necessarily change your effort, but just change your anticipation of, so that you don't have that drop. Are there times when you over exaggerate how much something's going to hurt? Again, you can go back and say, okay, so every single time I'm faced with the same situation, I always over exaggerate it and I always end up doing this, then that again is where you want to change that. So it's about finding the formula that works for you. How do I manage expectations, but also how do I jump wholeheartedly into reality and savor what I can as it's happening and not compare it to what I thought was going to happen and then decrease the enjoyment of what could have happened but now isn't, because you're experiencing it in your head and not in reality. So yeah, I don't know if that answered that question, but that's kind of my thoughts there.
And another question as well, and then so you guys still keep sending questions. I have one as well, but let me just give this one. Does optimism affect happiness negatively?
If it's so there's, I always refer back to studies, because when you do your graduate dissertation, you memorize all these things. There is a realistic optimism, also known as flexible optimism. And then I forget the other term, but I just call it ridiculous optimism. So I think it's good to be optimistic. It helps you get out of bed in the morning and continuing to work on things. But it's also another dangerous one where if you're being ridiculously optimistic and it's costing you and you're not realizing you're walking into a wall at your peril, then you're too optimistic. So I would never say drop your optimism to zero. No, we always need some optimism. But when the risk is high, drop it. When the risk is low, when you have nothing to lose, go for it. So it's, again, it's about knowing how to shift your thinking and how to manage your expectations, your beliefs, your thoughts in coordination with your actions. I know that is maybe not quite clear, but yeah, so always be optimistic, but understand that there are limits to optimism that may become harmful to you.
I love that, actually. Before I ask the last question, mindful of the time, I want to just show the audience where they can find you. So if you guys want to get in touch with Dr. Louise, if you want to stay in touch, follow her on LinkedIn, of course. You can scan the QR code that is right in front of you. So go ahead and take a moment to do that. And also you can visit the website, which is the happinessmatters.org. So make sure you check it out as well. Anywhere else they can find you? Are you on other social media?
Oh, that's good enough. I'm on Instagram as well, but yeah, it's just random silly things on there. So yeah, LinkedIn is good.
All right, great. And let me go ahead and ask a last question, and then
Sure.
we have a little giveaway thing for the audience. So what is one particular factor which keeps some people from going on and on in accumulating wealth, though it does not always contribute to happiness?
Oh,
Why do people keep accumulating wealth even though it doesn't really make them happy?
yeah. Oh, goodness. Well, there's lots of answers there. Now, wealth is not generally my area of research, but we do know that people who engage in excessive materialism, excessive consumption, it's bad for the environment. That's more my thing. But we also know that it undermines subjective well-being over time. So again, does money contribute to happiness? Yes, up until you meet your basic needs. After that, it's how you spend, and then it'd be focusing on experiences, learning, growth, giving to others, engaging in charitable actions. But just continuing to accumulate, we actually call this the hedonic treadmill. And it's exactly like a treadmill. So imagine you're running on a treadmill and somebody's just dangling a carrot. That's really what money is at the end of the day. Once you've met your basic needs, you're running for no conceivable reason. And the more you accumulate, for one, one of the dangers of all of this accumulation is the time you have spent working to make that happen. So you're actually not making time to enjoy it anyways, because you're always at work. Now, unless you're really lucky to work 1 hour a day and make all this money, then the equation is spend it wisely. But often this is what happens. People accumulate long hours at work. While you're working, you're not spending time doing exercise, you're not spending time with family, you're not socializing with friends, you're not committing time to learning something new, you're probably also not cooking for yourself, so your health suffers, your social life suffers, and life just becomes a little bit pointless and meaningless after a while. So why people do that? I think social pressure. There's still a lot of pressure to, show that you're successful outwardly. And money is, admittedly a good way to do that. It doesn't necessarily guarantee a good life, but so I think a lot of social pressure there. And I think for certain people, it's covering a need, covering an emotional need that they're not necessarily addressing, and trying to cover that up with money. So for example, it could be a need to feel in control. It could also be a need to be busy doing this so that they don't need to necessarily be emotionally vulnerable in a relationship, for example, because I have to work late is a really good excuse. So I think I would invite that person to kind of think about, what does money represent for you? What is it you're trying to gain? And when is enough enough? And do you ever reach the point of it being enough? And if not, like, what would help you feel like you're enough? And it's probably not money, because if they've been doing that for a long time, it's clearly not working because they're continuing to do it. Yeah.
Louise, just to add on to your point, in fact, I was thinking about the fact that we always underestimate how difficult it is to change a behavior. So if we have always been doing the same, we tend to continue doing the same. Our brain, in fact, is a storage of habits that we have been created since we were children. So we store all these behaviors, and that's why whenever we want to break this behavior, we have fear, so it doesn't happen. And this is something to consider. That's why people continue doing, even though it doesn't have the expected results.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is where the idea of small habits is easy. So you do not need to transform your whole life and be, some prancing, joyful unicorn, right? Like, just do one little tiny thing that makes you happy every day. It could just be like a minute. And when you choose it, you're more likely to do it because you've chosen it and it fits you in some way. So yeah, tiny steps.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting that also in the work with clients that we do sometimes, they say, well, I want to reach this position. And I always challenge them, said, but why? Like, what happens when you're there? Like, what is it about it? Like, and what I noticed with clients is that sometimes we don't even know why we're aiming for something. So if anything, a couple of takeaways for the audience today is why you're doing what you're doing. What's the purpose behind it? Also looking at, as Dr. Louise mentioned, looking at what are the things you're doing each day. What are things that bring you energy and that fulfillment, whatever you want to call it, that joy, versus things that don't bring you energy, don't bring you those feelings, right? So looking, just really auditing your day-to-day, auditing your habits, and understanding that you don't need to be happy continuously. It's unrealistic, and you shouldn't be, otherwise we might have a problem. So just taking a moment, I think this is some of the things, the important factors that I took away from this, and I hope that our audience also takes that away. And I'm just mindful of the time, guys, but a few people said thank you. So thank you for the content. I want to just take a moment, guys, bring your attention to this screen for just a moment. So we talked a lot about how do you create that, how do you keep yourself, somebody asked, how do you keep yourself inspired, living a good life? And at the end of the day, it's about the habits and routines you create, or what are you unlearning? What are you learning? So this is something we've created. Actually, it's a challenge, and it's really just an impactful 10-day challenge that we've created. And for the audience that's attending, so those of you who guys are online right now, you can bring a friend, so your friend will join you for free if you bring a friend. But this is a 10-day challenge where it is only $1 a day, so total is $10 for this challenge that is packed with habit creation, that is packed with you creating achieving your goals, essentially. So whether you're looking to progress in your career, whether you're looking to become more productive, whether you're looking to get in shape or become a little bit happier, whatever that is for you, this is a challenge for you. And you're going to have a ton of support throughout and a community to join. And as we discussed, relationships are important, so you're going to be in good company for this challenge. And so if you guys are interested, for those of you on here, if you drop us an email, we'll give you a free spot as well, so you can bring a friend, because it's always more fun to do things with friends. So make sure you drop us an email. You can just scan the QR code or email us same email where you got this invitation from. So from you guys, any last words?
Elena, it starts the 15th of September, so it's next week, 10 days of the challenge. That was my last word.
Yes.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, thank you all. And yeah, I mean, last words is you just do you.
I love it. Do you?
Just do you.
Yeah, love it. Dr. Louise, thank you so much.
My
thank
pleasure.
you for the insights. Thank you guys for the questions and interaction. Yvonne, thank you for participating and guiding us as well. I wish you all happiness. Just kidding.
Thank you.
Wish you all whatever makes you joyful in life. Have
A good life.
lovely,
There you go.
a good life, whatever that looks like for you.
Exactly.
Have a nice evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.